you'll turn over in your Bibles to the book of Ephesians, and we're going to notice a concept in Ephesians chapter 3. Ephesians chapter 3, starting in verse 17, it says that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. We want to take a look at the breadth and length and depth and height of the love of God, but as it notes here, it passes knowledge. We want to look at the love of Christ that passes knowledge. Now, in order to understand the love of Christ, for it to make any sense to us at all, we first must understand the holiness of God. We have to understand the holiness of God, and we have to understand the sinfulness of man, the fact that we were created perfect, and yet we fell from that. We went in our own direction and did what we wanted to do, and we were dead at that point. 2 Corinthians 5:14 says, "For the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead. Christ died for us, therefore all were dead that he died for." We were dead at that point, and we have to understand that in order to understand the love of Christ. Now, as we think about the love of Christ that passes knowledge, as it talks about here in Ephesians chapter 3, and we think about Christ dying for us, it is one thing for someone to die for their friend. As a matter of fact, in John chapter 15, Jesus describes this as the greatest form of love, to die for your friend. But it is another thing to die for your enemy, and yet another to allow your son to go and die for your enemy, to send your son to go and die for your enemy. And then to think that you would send your son to go and die for your enemy in spite of the fact that you know that a majority of your enemies are not even going to accept that salvation that you're offering, but just to do it anyway, just to give them that chance. Jesus describing himself and God having sent him to this earth in Mark chapter 12 and verse 6, it says, "Having therefore one son, his well-beloved, he sent him also last unto them, saying, They will reverence my son. But they took him and they killed him." That is a very beautiful illustration or example of the love that Christ had for us, God sending his son into the world to die for us. It is one thing for a friend to die for another friend. It is another thing for someone to die for their enemy, but it is yet another for someone to send their son to die for that enemy, and then to think that enemy would not even accept that love in the majority of the cases. This is a love that goes beyond our ability to comprehend just on a human level. But where the love of Christ really goes beyond our ability to understand is when we think that it was God in the flesh dying for us, the Creator dying for the creation. That's where it really goes beyond our ability to understand. And I think a beautiful example and a beautiful description of this comes from Philippians chapter 2, whenever he talks about how Christ was equal with God, and yet he came down and took upon himself the form of a man, and then he was obedient unto death, even death on the cross. One of the most brutal deaths you could possibly come up with, possibly think about. God sent his son down into the world to die for us. That was the most convincing thing that God could have possibly done for us as human beings, to convince us to choose heaven and reject hell, and yet we know a majority of human beings are not going to accept that anyway. And then to think the love of Christ goes even farther, to think that he was willing to be rejected by the Father, the ultimate form of punishment for sin, to be rejected by the Father on the cross and suffer the punishment that we deserved, that separation from the Father because of the sins of the world. To think that God the Father would be willing to love us enough to send his Son, God the Son, into the world to become a man, to be rejected by the Father on the cross, to die in one of the most brutal ways known to man for his enemies, most of whom would not even accept that salvation and that hope that he offered, but to do it anyway, just to give them that chance, just to give them that opportunity if they were willing to accept it. That is a love that completely passes our ability to understand, but as it says here in Ephesians chapter 3, that is just a small sampling of the breadth and length and depth and height of the love of God. And then to me, one of the most just beautiful aspects of the love of God, after he did all that, after he put that out there for us, in Luke chapter 15, it describes Jesus as a good shepherd who is out there looking for us. He's out there trying to find us and bring us back. He did all of that. He didn't need to do any of it to give us that chance, and yet now he's out there looking for us to try and bring us back in. And one of the final things I want us to think about, in light of the love of Christ that passes our ability to understand, it passes our ability to understand, it definitely passes our ability to put into words and describe to other people. How do we go about describing this love to the world? How do we express this love to the world in a way that they will understand? And the short answer is you can't. You can't fully explain this love to the world in a way that does it justice. But I think the closest thing that we can possibly do is to live this love out in our lives. If we live our lives in a way that every aspect of our lives is glorifying God, bringing glory to Him, pointing people back to the cross, showing the love of Christ in the way that we treat each other as Christians, loving each other like Christ has loved us, that is the very closest thing we can do as Christians to express this love to the world that completely passes our ability to understand. That is just a small sampling of the breadth and length and depth and height of the love of God. And to leave you with one final thought, comes from a song titled "The Love of God." I think it sums it up very perfectly when the songwriter put it this way. He says, "Could we with ink the ocean fill, and were the skies of parchment made, were every stalk on earth a quill, and every man a scribe by trade, to write the love of God above would drain the ocean dry, nor could the scroll contain the whole, though stretched from sky to sky." Thank you.